Hey, what's up, AP World? We have chapter 34 for you, Franklin Roosevelt in the Shadow of War, 1933 to 1941. So we are going to cover all the important stuff that you need to know going up to World War II. All right, we're going to start with the London Conference from 1933. And the purpose of this conference was to provide an organized and coordinated international attack on the global depression. Keep in mind, in 1933, the Great Depression is in full effect. So countries of the world are getting together and trying to figure out how to reverse this. Roosevelt, however, ends up withdrawing, and the U.S. withdraws from this conference for fear of sacrificing the U.S. economy for the world economy. So basically, in what's going to follow is all countries are going to be focused on fixing themselves as opposed to helping the collective good of the entire world. And this helps reflect the main idea of the 1920s and the 1930s, which is that the U.S. wants isolation. That is a big idea to know in the 1920s and 30s. Okay, we're going to talk about the Philippines, and remember that they were gained as a result of the Spanish-American War. And if you want to review the Spanish-American War, please check out my video, APUSH Review the Spanish-American War. The Tidings-McDuffie Act promised Philippines freedom, and they actually end up getting this in 1946, on July 4th, 1946. And in 1933, the U.S. also formally recognized the Soviet Union. So about 15, 16 years after the Soviet Union became communist, the U.S. officially recognizes this. And FDR does so for a couple of reasons. One, he hoped to trade with the Soviet Union. And two, it was to kind of counteract Germany and Japan, who are militaristic and beginning of becoming very aggressive. The U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America is going to change under FDR, and it's called the good neighbor policy. And this is very important to know. This does appear quite often on APUSH exams. The goal of the good neighbor policy is to improve relationships with Latin America. And is the good neighbor policy a success? Absolutely. The relationship definitely improves between the two sides. It renounced armed intervention on behalf of the U.S., and it pretty much overturned the Roosevelt corollary. So President Theodore Roosevelt's idea of U.S. becoming this world police power in Latin America is overturned. The improved relations would also help defend the Western Hemisphere against any potential threat from Europe as well. So the 1930s and 40s definitely saw an improvement in the relationship between America and Latin America. One issue that we'll see in the 30s is the issue of tariffs, which has really been around forever in U.S. history. And the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act under FDR is fairly important. And what it does is it gives Roosevelt the power to lower tariff rates on specific countries if they did the same. So let's say, for instance, the U.S. lowers tariff rates on British-made goods. They could do that. Roosevelt could do that if Britain lowered rates on American goods as well. And this was passed in response to previous high tariffs, such as the Hawley-Smoot tariff and the Ford-Macomber tariff. Those two major tariffs from the late 20s and 30s that really jacked up the tariff rate for foreign countries. And this actually improves trade, which in theory will help out with the world economy. Okay, growth of totalitarianism in the 1930s. We have in Europe, we have Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini coming to power. In Japan, we have Emperor Hirohito. Japan becomes very militaristic. Japan and Germany during this time are seeking to expand their borders. Japan is going to start invading China, and Germany is going to start taking over neighboring land that they lost after World War I through the Treaty of Versailles. Japan also begins building battleships in violation of previous treaties, and isolationism in the U.S. increases. Many Americans feel, let whatever happens in Europe stay in Europe. We can't get involved again. Many people do not want to go through another World War. So the Nye Committee is a very important aspect that does appear quite often as well. It was headed by this guy, Gerald Nye. He was a senator. And there are all these allegations in the 1930s that the U.S. became involved in World War I simply to make money for munitions companies or companies that built war products. In actuality, this really isn't true because these companies were making lots of money by trading with foreign companies anyway. But this was a very substantial rumor that was going around at the time, and this helped again increase isolation. People wanted to stay out of European affairs. So we have a series of neutrality acts, 35, 36, and 37, not to be confused with 39, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. And this says if there's a war, restrictions automatically take effect. America could not sail on a country's ship that is involved in a war. They could not sell weapons, and they could not lend money. In theory, This might sound like a good idea. It would keep America out of involvement, but there's no distinction. As the book said, there's no distinction between brutal aggressors and innocent victims. So, a country that gets taken over by Japan or Germany, for instance, the U.S. couldn't help them because automatically, if there's a war going on, these acts apply to everybody who is involved, whether they are the aggressor or the victims. And again, this whole idea, I can't stress this enough, guys, this idea of isolation and people don't want to be involved in foreign affairs. So there's even a civil war kind of breaking out in Spain, and there's a war in Spain between the fascists and the left-leaning government, which is supported by the USSR. And the fascists are supported by Germany. And due to the Neutrality Acts, the U.S. could not help in the fight against the fascists. So automatically, the U.S. had an opportunity, or could have had an opportunity, to provide help against the fascists, but because of the Neutrality Acts, they couldn't, and Spain was doomed. This slide is probably the most important slide in this whole chapter, Appeasing Japan and Germany. We have the quarantine speech. This is FDR's speech in response to aggressive actions by Italy and Japan, specifically when Japan invaded Manchuria and China and Italy takes over Ethiopia. And he felt that countries should quarantine aggressive nations, and he was insinuating that countries should come together and place an embargo on these aggressive nations, an economic embargo. Isolationists were furious with FDR. They feared that his words could help lead to a war. Panay incident is a ship, an American gunboat that is sunk by the Japanese. And Americans are furious with Japan. Some still don't want to go to war. Japan ends up apologizing. Germany is violating the Treaty of Versailles during the 1930s under Hitler. They're building up the military. They're marching into the Rhineland, which is supposed to be demilitarized. They're taking over portions of Austria, the Sudetenland. They're going to go into Czechoslovakia and take all of that. It's just every single time Hitler does that, everybody gives into him or appeases him. There is something called the Munich Conference, and this is one of the most important things that leads up to World War II. And here is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Neville Chamberlain, and he holds in his hand this paper signed at the Munich Conference, and he proclaims to the world that there will be a long-lasting peace in Europe, and he just secured peace. And what this does is it gives Germany the Sudetenland, and Hitler promised not to take over more land. He ends up violating this about 6 months later or so. But this exemplifies appeasement. And appeasement is simply giving in to the demands of an aggressor. Okay, in August of 1939, Hitler and Stalin shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact. This is not an alliance, but simply an agreement that the two sides will not fight each other. Here's a very famous political cartoon. It says, "Wonder how long the honeymoon will last." And this shocks people because fascists and communists do not like each other whatsoever. But Stalin wanted to ensure that he wouldn't be invaded, and Germany wanted to ensure that if they took over other land, that the Soviet Union would not get involved. September 1st of that year, a couple weeks later, is the invasion of Poland, and that starts World War I. I teach global history too, and I always tell my students this rhyme: 9/1/39, Hitler says Poland's mine. 9/1/39, Hitler says Poland's mine. 9 September, 1 the date, 39 the year. Hitler says Poland's mine, and it starts World War II. And Britain and France is in need of weapons now that the war has started. So the U.S. passes the Neutrality Act of 1939, which says that European democracies could buy weapons on a cash and carry basis. So this slightly amended the previous Neutrality Acts. The U.S. can sell weapons to a European democracy, but this cash and carry means they have to pay cash for it right up front, and they have to come and pick up the items on their own. The U.S. ships are not going to go to them. They need to come to the U.S. ships. And the U.S. is no longer truly neutral after this time, and we'll see them get closer and closer, declaring war. In June of 1940, France falls to Hitler, and within 6 weeks, I think it is, or some time frame like that, Germany takes over France. And basically what's left in Europe is just Great Britain. England stood alone. The U.S. began building its own military. And in September 6 of 1940, this is the first time in U.S. history there is a peacetime conscription law, which is just a fancy way of saying there is a draft. At the Havana Conference in 1940, the U.S. and Latin America agreed that they would uphold the Monroe Doctrine and they wouldn't allow Germany or any European country to come in and take over. So this is kind of increased cooperation, and this could be seen as a result of the good neighbor policy as well. Okay, Germany is bombing the crap out of England in preparation for invasion, and this is one of Hitler's two major mistakes he makes during the war. So the question is, does the U.S. become this fortress of America, this idea of building up America, defending itself if need be, or do they cross the line and help out Britain? Well, there's going to be two different groups that emerge at this time. The Committee to Defend America was in favor of aiding the Allies by giving them money, giving them supplies, whatever they needed to succeed. The America First Committee, and here is, I know this is, I'll zoom in and it's going to be a little tough to see here. This is actually Charles Lindbergh giving a speech at this American First Committee, and you notice right next to Lindbergh here is a portrait of George Washington and this idea that the U.S. should remain neutral. The American First Committee was against American involvement. Committee to Defend America, in favor of aiding the Allies with money, supplies, whatever they needed. The American First Committee against American involvement on any level. In September of 1940, Roosevelt gave Britain a bunch of U.S. ships from World War I in return for some bases all over the world. So America is helping out Great Britain more and more. And most Americans at this time were in favor of any aid necessary in short of war. So they didn't want to send troops over, but any amount of money or anything that Britain needed, most Americans would support that. In 1940, FDR runs for his third term. He shatters the two-term tradition. He's running against a guy by the name of Wendell Willkie, who condemned the New Deal, hated it, and thought the government got too big, was taxing too much, was producing a society that was against his idea of America, and he even accused FDR of being a dictator. And FDR whoops him in this election, as you can see, 449 to 82. So Willkie wins 10 states to. Congress passes something called the Lend-Lease Act. Very important to know. I can guarantee this will be on any test that you take and probably even on the APUSH exam as well. So March 1941, this allows the U.S. to send supplies to victims of aggression, and this idea is billions, not bodies. So June 1944, $20 billion is going that way. Most of it is through munitions, some is through food, some is through materials necessary like oil, and some is even different services. But this is seen as an economic declaration of war, and it officially marked the end of U.S. neutrality. And Germany, in return, started sinking American ships. So the U.S. armed these ships, as we'll see, and they institute a shoot-on-sight policy in which the U.S. could sink German ships. June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa officially ends the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, and Hitler invades the Soviet Union, one of his major mistakes. And he and Napoleon made enormous mistakes by invading the Soviet Union. You never do that because it's too big and it's too cold. At something called the Atlantic Conference, Roosevelt and Churchill meet, and they have this idea of how the post-war world should look afterwards. They wanted no territorial exchanges, and they even had an idea of a new League of Nations, which would become the United Nations. And later on, Stalin agrees to many of these ideas from the Atlantic Conference. 1941, so about 6 months before the U.S. gets involved in World War II, Roosevelt decides U.S. ships would escort the Lend-Lease supplies to Iceland. This idea that the U.S. would transport these ships and protect them. Roosevelt orders a shoot-on-sight policy that if they see a German U-boat, they are to shoot it immediately. And in November of 1941, merchant ships could now legally be armed as well, so they could be prepared to attack as well. Huge, huge, huge change in foreign policy. Late 1940 to 1941, the U.S. does enact some embargoes on Japan and freezes Japanese assets in the United States. So if they had money in the bank, that money would be frozen. That infuriates Japan, and on December 7th, 1941, we have a day that will live in infamy forever, the attack on Pearl Harbor. There are roughly 3,000 casualties. And here is Pearl Harbor today. This is actually a memorial. You can go there if you've ever been to Hawaii. I have not been there yet. It is on my bucket list to go there. But you can see this is a ship that was sunk during Pearl Harbor. Okay, that is chapter 34 for you. I hope I explained everything well enough. If not, please do not hesitate to leave something in the comments if you need clarification, if you need me to explain something better. I appreciate you guys watching. Please subscribe if you have not already, and tell everybody in your class about the video. Let me get this video to as many people as possible. I would really appreciate it. Check out all my other videos as well, and I wish you nothing but the best of luck on your test. Thank you for watching. Have a good day, guys.